He built a hotel empire from nothing, but when he walked into one of his own luxury resorts, they treated him like a nobody. Was it a simple mistake, or something far worse hiding behind the polished smiles? What Charles Bennett uncovered that night didn't just shake the hotel, it threatened to expose everything. Stay tuned. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. You ever walk into a place and feel like you don't exist? Not in some deep, existential way, but like you're genuinely invisible to everyone around you? That's exactly how Charles Bennett felt the moment he stepped into the marble-clad lobby of the Grand Crest, one of the flagship hotels of Bennett Hospitality Group, the empire he had built from scratch. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the scent of luxury perfumed the air, and yet, for the front desk, it was as if Charles might as well have been a shadow. No suit today, no assistant trailing behind, no signature lapel pin. Just Charles in a plain navy jacket and worn leather shoes, standing in line like any other guest. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very hotel designed to make every guest feel like royalty now treated him like background noise. But Charles wasn't here to be pampered. He was here because complaints had been stacking up. Not just the occasional bad review, but a steady flow of accusations about staff dismissiveness, discriminatory behavior, and guests mysteriously being bumped from reservations. Charles could have handled it the traditional way, sent a regional manager, issued memos, held sensitivity trainings. He knew better. Issues like these didn't die quietly, they rotted, and rot needed to be cut out, not covered up. So he stood there, intentionally unrecognizable, waiting to see if the rumors were true. And then it happened. The desk clerk, a young blonde woman named Rachel Collins, sitting right beneath a sparkling sign reading "Excellence is our standard," didn't even glance up. She scrolled on her phone, completely ignoring the man who had literally built the place she was being paid to represent. Charles shifted his weight, cleared his throat. Nothing. He tapped the counter gently. Rachel sighed dramatically, like the mere sound of another human's existence was an inconvenience. Without looking up, she muttered, "Yeah?" And just like that, Charles got his answer, and a slow, cold anger settled deep in his chest. This wasn't going to be a quiet visit. No, he'd come here to fix a problem, and now he was certain he wasn't leaving until it was fixed. Charles kept his composure, but the irritation simmering beneath the surface was undeniable. He had dealt with worse in boardrooms and hostile takeovers, but this was personal. He leaned slightly forward, voice calm but edged with authority. "Reservation for Charles Bennett." Rachel barely glanced up, pecking lazily at the keyboard. "Don't see it," she said flatly, her eyes dropping right back to her phone. No apology, no effort, no second glance. Charles' brow twitched, but he didn't flinch. He'd played this game before, just never in his own house. "Could you check again?" he asked, steady. Rachel sighed like he'd just asked her to solve world hunger. "I already did," she muttered, twirling her pen between two fingers. "Maybe you booked the wrong property." Charles clenched his jaw. "The Grand Crest," he clarified, voice firmer, eyes narrowing. Rachel gave him a condescending smile. "Happens all the time, sir." "Sir." The word dripped with dismissiveness, not respect. For a moment, Charles felt the sting he knew countless guests must have felt standing at this very desk. Invisible, ignored, unwelcome. He slowly pulled out his phone, showing the clear confirmation email. His name, his reservation, his hotel. Rachel gave it the briefest glance before shrugging. "Well, if it's not in the system, I can't help you." There it was, not even pretending. Charles could see it now. She had made up her mind about him the moment he walked in. Wrong look, wrong tone, wrong skin. He wasn't a guest, he was a problem. But what Rachel didn't know, what made this moment sing with irony, was that she wasn't brushing off some powerless tourist. She was brushing off the man who signed the paychecks. And Charles wasn't about to walk away quietly. He nodded once, lips pressed tight, then calmly took out a second phone, the one linked to the internal system. With a few quick taps, he pulled up his reservation, still active, still booked, and more importantly, freshly canceled. He checked the audit log. Deleted. By Rachel Collins. Charles took a slow breath. Oh, it was going to be one of those nights. And Rachel had no idea who she was playing with. Charles leaned against the polished counter, his demeanor unreadable, eyes never leaving Rachel. "Tell me, Rachel," he said slowly, savoring every word. "What happens when a front desk clerk deletes a reservation?" Rachel's fingers tensed around her pen, but she forced a casual shrug. "It just removes it from the system," she mumbled, eyes flicking nervously to the side. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "And who has the power to do that?" "Only the front desk staff," she answered, voice a touch weaker. "Like yourself," Charles pressed. Rachel's throat bobbed. Yes." Then Charles turned the phone toward her, the audit log in full view. Her name, her employee ID, the exact timestamp she had manually deleted his reservation. Gone was the indifference. Gone was the attitude. Rachel's face paled faster than the marble beneath her elbows. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Charles leaned in, his voice soft but sharp. "So, Rachel, why did you delete my reservation?" His question hung heavy in the air, like the slow click of a cocked gun. The silence dragged long enough that even the guests lounging nearby started to take notice, their heads subtly turning. Rachel stammered, I mean, it must be a mistake." Her usual smirk nowhere to be found, replaced by a stiff, panicked expression. Charles arched a brow, completely unimpressed. "Funny, because the system doesn't make mistakes, people do." Rachel's mouth opened and closed uselessly. Charles resisted the urge to smile. There it was, the unraveling. She knew she was caught. "Look," she tried again, feigning calm. "Maybe it's just a glitch." "No glitch," Charles interrupted, standing tall, voice like steel. "You took one look at me and made a choice." The color drained from her face. Charles exhaled, slow and steady. He wasn't angry, he was patient. This wasn't just about him. It was about every guest she'd treated this way. And tonight, she was about to learn that no one mistreated guests under his roof, not without consequences. The lobby, once indifferent, now buzzed with tension. Rachel realized too late she wasn't in control anymore. Charles didn't rush. He stood there, watching Rachel scramble behind the counter, pretending to double-check the system as if a technical error might somehow save her. But Charles knew better. This wasn't about a glitch. It was about deliberate sabotage. Rachel's fingers trembled as she finally stammered, I think there might be a room after all." Charles tilted his head slightly, playing along. "Oh?" Suddenly something opened up. She nodded, avoiding eye contact, and slid a key card across the counter. "Room 927, she muttered. Charles took one look at the card and chuckled softly. He knew that room well. Right by the elevators, thin walls, and overlooking the hotel's industrial alley, where the garbage compactors roared all night. A punishment room, often reserved for guests who had the audacity to complain. "Room 927, Charles repeated, raising an eyebrow. Rachel's forced smile faltered. "Yes, sir, it's the best we have available." Charles leaned in, lowering his voice to a quiet warning. "Do I look like someone you can lie to, Rachel?" The color drained from her face again. Other staff members and a few guests were now openly watching the scene unfold. The tension wrapped around the lobby like a noose. Charles gently slid the key card back to her. "Let's try that again." Rachel fumbled with the computer, cheeks burning, eyes darting around for help, but none came. The young bellboy at the concierge desk pretended to rearrange pamphlets, but stole glances and fascination. Guests whispered behind menus in the lobby lounge. The pressure was mounting, and Rachel was drowning under it. Finally, without meeting Charles's gaze, she handed him another key. "Room 4501, she choked out. Charles smirked inwardly. He'd designed that room himself, a penthouse suite. Now, that's more like it. He calmly accepted the key. "Thank you, Rachel," he said coolly. "I'll be sure to share this experience." She blinked, confused, but he offered nothing more. Not yet. Oh, the real surprise was still coming. Charles stepped into the penthouse suite with the kind of practiced calm only years of leadership could produce. He closed the door behind him, letting the muffled sounds of the bustling hotel fade into silence. Inside, the suite was immaculate. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline, and every luxury touch he'd personally signed off on. But tonight, none of that mattered. He pulled out his laptop, sat at the sleek glass desk, and went straight to work. Charles wasn't here just to enjoy a night at his own hotel. He was here to investigate. Within minutes, he accessed the hotel's internal records, not as a guest, but as the founder and CEO. Every complaint, every staff report, every guest experience from the past year was laid bare before him. And Rachel's name? It was everywhere. Dozens of entries, each more troubling than the last. Reports of rude behavior, accusations of deleting or tampering with reservations, and even subtle patterns suggesting certain guests, those who looked like Charles, were consistently, accidentally, downgraded, dismissed, or denied. His eyes narrowed as he followed the digital trail. It wasn't just carelessness, it was systemic. And worse, it was tolerated. Every one of Rachel's incidents had been swept under the rug by the same person, Victor Hale, the hotel's manager. Charles leaned back in his chair, processing what he already suspected. Victor had been in charge here for 5 years. Too long, Charles realized, for this kind of rot to have gone unnoticed by accident. He thought back to the flood of complaints that prompted his visit. This wasn't an isolated issue. This was culture. Charles took a deep breath and cracked his knuckles. No more second chances. Not for Rachel, not for Victor. Not for anyone who thought they could taint the empire he built. Tonight wasn't about making an example. It was about cleansing the entire system, from the lobby to the penthouse. The next morning, the sun barely breaking over the skyline, Charles descended into the lobby with a calm that masked the storm brewing underneath. He stood back for a moment, watching how the staff operated when they thought no one important was watching. Rachel was at the front desk again, leaning against the counter scrolling on her phone, while Victor stood nearby, chatting idly with another employee, oblivious to the guests queuing at the desk. Charles observed quietly as 2 guests, a young black couple, approached the counter. Rachel barely glanced up, sighed, and, without even checking the system, informed them their room wasn't ready. Despite check-in officially starting an hour ago, the couple exchanged an uncomfortable look. Rachel, unimpressed by their presence, returned to her phone without offering alternatives or apologies. That was enough. Charles adjusted his jacket and stepped forward. His polished shoes clicking against the marble drew Victor's attention first, followed quickly by Rachel's. Both froze. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Rachel, Victor," he said, calmly but with weight. "I believe it's time we had a conversation." The shift was immediate. Rachel's face drained of color as she recognized him. Victor's eyes widened in horror. The guests nearby stopped pretending not to listen. The room thickened with tension. "Mr. Bennett," Victor stammered, stepping forward. We weren't expecting—" "Clearly," Charles cut him off, voice steady. He turned to Rachel. "And you must be the one who couldn't find my reservation last night. Strange, considering I built this hotel." Rachel's eyes darted between Charles and Victor, searching desperately for an exit. There wasn't one. Charles slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID, laying it on the counter. The gold-embossed card simply read, "Charles Bennett, founder and CEO." Gasps rippled quietly across the lobby. Guests and staff alike realized the gravity of the moment. "Here's how this is going to go," Charles continued, still calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Victor, Rachel, my office, now." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving them no choice but to follow. The storm had officially arrived, and there would be no shelter for either of them. Inside the executive suite, the air was thick with discomfort. Rachel sat rigidly on the edge of the leather chair, wringing her fingers, while Victor shifted anxiously, avoiding Charles's piercing gaze. Charles stood by the window, staring out over the city as if weighing their fates against the skyline itself. He didn't speak right away. Silence was its own punishment, and both Rachel and Victor were feeling every second of it. Finally, Charles turned, his face unreadable. "Tell me," he began softly, "how does a hotel that promises dignity and excellence to every guest end up with employees who decide who's worthy of being seen?" Neither dared to answer. Charles took deliberate steps toward them. Was it policy to delete reservations without cause? Or perhaps the mission statement changed overnight, one I wasn't informed about? Victor fumbled. "Mr. Bennett, I admit we've had some staffing challenges, but we were working on improving things." Charles raised a brow. "Working on it?" "Victor, I have months of guest complaints, employee reports, and now first-hand experience showing me exactly the opposite." He turned to Rachel. "And you, Rachel, care to explain your part?" Rachel's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. It wasn't personal. I thought—" "You thought," Charles cut in sharply, "that I didn't belong here?" Rachel's lips trembled. "No, sir, I made a mistake." Charles's voice dropped, quieter but more dangerous. "No, Rachel. A mistake is a clerical error. What you did was a choice." He let the words hang heavy. Rachel's eyes welled with tears, and Victor visibly shrunk in his chair. "This isn't just about me," Charles continued. "You've made guests feel less than human. Guests who trusted us to make them feel welcomed." He stepped back. "You've humiliated my brand, my legacy." The gravity of his words crushed any hope Rachel or Victor might have had. Charles wasn't just angry, he was disappointed, and that cut deeper than any yelling ever could. "I hope you both enjoyed your time here," Charles said calmly, "because it ends today." Rachel gasped softly, and Victor's head dropped into his hands. Charles turned to the intercom. "Security, escort these two from the building. Their employment is terminated, effective immediately." Justice wasn't loud, it was final. Rachel and Victor's exit was nothing short of a spectacle. The lobby, once buzzing with polite chatter and the soft clink of coffee cups, fell into an uneasy silence as two security guards approached. Rachel's eyes darted wildly, silently pleading with anyone who would meet her gaze, but no one stepped forward. The staff she had once barked orders at now watched in stunned disbelief. Victor trailed behind, shoulders slumped, face pale, looking less like a manager and more like a man walking toward a sentence he had seen coming for years. As the doors slid shut behind them, Charles remained in place, letting the silence speak for him. Then he stepped forward, turning to the remaining employees and guests with a calm, commanding presence. "Let's make something clear," he said, voice steady but firm. "This hotel was built on the promise of treating every person who walks through those doors like they belong here, with dignity, respect, and care. Somewhere along the way we lost that. That ends today." The employees behind the front desk stood frozen, exchanging nervous glances. Guests, sensing the shift, began whispering, realizing that this wasn't just some hotel manager making a show. This was someone with authority, with power. Charles continued, "Starting immediately, this hotel will undergo a complete internal audit. Every complaint will be reviewed, every staff member reevaluated. No more excuses, no more overlooking problems." He wasn't raising his voice, but somehow it carried through every corner of the lobby like a cold breeze. "If you cannot serve every guest who comes through those doors equally, respectfully, and professionally, you won't be here much longer." His words hit like a slow-building storm. The staff's nervous expressions told him they understood exactly what he meant. Some nodded in silent agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing change was inevitable. Then Charles softened slightly. "But for those of you who do your jobs with integrity, you're about to be rewarded, because this hotel," he gestured around the room, "is about to become the crown jewel of this city again." There it was, the spark. Some of the younger employees straightened their posture, hope flashing in their eyes. Change wasn't just coming, it was already here, and Charles Bennett was making sure of it. Later that evening, Charles sat alone in the grand suite, the very room Victor used to reserve for visiting executives, now reclaimed by the man who truly owned it. The city lights outside flickered like stars scattered across a dark ocean, but inside, the room was quiet, heavy with reflection. Charles stared out the window, swirling a glass of water in his hand. Not champagne, not scotch, just water. The day had been draining, not physically but emotionally. For years, he had trusted managers like Victor to uphold the standards he built. But clearly time had bred complacency, entitlement, and worse, prejudice. And he'd let it happen under his own name. He took a deep breath, his reflection staring back at him in the window. "No more," he muttered under his breath. No more hiding behind layers of management. No more trusting others to enforce the vision he had bled to create. Charles reached for his laptop and began composing a series of emails. One to the board, outlining immediate structural changes across all his properties. Another to the entire staff of the hotel, informing them of the upcoming audit, sweeping reforms, and a direct line of communication with him for complaints or suggestions. He wasn't just fixing this hotel. He was setting a new standard for the entire empire. When he finally closed the laptop, exhaustion weighed on him, but so did a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As he stood to pour himself another glass of water, a soft knock came at the door. Opening it, Charles was greeted by Lydia, the young housekeeper who had been humiliated earlier. She stood nervously, holding a sealed envelope and a small card. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, I just wanted to thank you." Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from several staff members expressing their gratitude. Lydia blinked back tears. "No one's ever stood up for us like that." Charles felt his throat tighten. He wasn't a man easily swayed by emotions, but in that moment he knew the real reward wasn't just fixing a hotel. It was restoring dignity to people who had nearly given up hope. "Thank you, Lydia," he said, voice steady. "You deserve better. You all do." And this time, he meant every word. The next morning, the entire hotel felt different, as if the walls themselves knew change was coming. Charles stepped into the lobby, this time not as the invisible man from the night before, but as the towering presence of the owner himself. The staff, who had whispered rumors all night, now stood stiff behind the desk and scattered throughout the lobby. Lydia, standing beside a few of her housekeeping colleagues, nodded quietly as he passed. Charles walked directly to the center of the room, drawing every eye without saying a word. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who didn't need to shout to command the room. "Some of you already know who I am," he began, glancing around. "For those who don't, I'm Charles Bennett. I own this hotel, and every hotel with the Bennett name on it." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. The young bellhop from the previous night nearly dropped his clipboard. Charles continued, "I came here because I kept hearing complaints, not from executives, but from guests, employees, and people who felt unseen." His eyes locked on each staff member, especially those who had grown too comfortable ignoring the very people they were paid to serve. "From this moment on, that stops." The room fell silent. "We will be conducting a full audit. Every complaint will be reviewed. Every employee will be reevaluated. If you have the heart to treat every guest with dignity, you'll be part of this new chapter. If you don't, you won't." His words weren't angry, but they carried weight. Charles wasn't just giving a speech, he was drawing a line in the sand, and for the first time in a long while, the Bennett Grand Hotel felt like it belonged to everyone again, not just the privileged few. By the time Charles returned to his penthouse suite later that evening, the atmosphere of the entire hotel had shifted. The lobby staff worked with newfound urgency, whispers about the owner's surprise inspection circulating like wildfire. Lydia, who had quietly suffered under Stephen's indifference and Kim's tyranny, now held her head higher, as if someone had finally switched the lights on after years in the dark. From his suite, Charles watched from the balcony as bellhops, concierges, and front desk clerks nervously adjusted their uniforms and posture, aware that the game had changed. He sipped his coffee, calm but resolute. Then came the knock. Stephen stood at the door, sweating and pale, holding an envelope marked "Immediate Resignation." His hands trembled as he passed it to Charles without a word. Charles didn't flinch. He accepted the envelope, set it aside, and gave Stephen one final, knowing nod. "Good decision," Charles said, dismissing him like a bad memory. Stephen shuffled away, shoulders slumped, a man who had failed himself more than his employer. Charles closed the door and exhaled deeply. Not out of relief, but determination. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was rebuilding it brick by brick. That night, Charles called a staff-wide meeting, not to deliver threats, but to cast a vision where every guest, regardless of appearance, background, or title, would be treated like royalty, where integrity wasn't just a buzzword, but the standard. As his employees, some hopeful, others ashamed, listened in silence, Charles made one thing unmistakably clear. The Bennett Grand will no longer be known for its luxury alone, but for its humanity. The room, usually so transactional, filled with something rare: dignity, purpose, and the flicker of hope. And Charles knew, for the first time in a long time, he had come home. In a world where power often hides behind titles and wealth, this story reminds us that true leadership reveals itself in the quiet decisions to do what is right, even when no one is watching. Charles Bennett could have ignored the whispers, dismissed the complaints, or solved the problem with a few impersonal emails. Instead, he chose to stand face to face with the dysfunction, to confront the biases, negligence, and entitlement poisoning his own creation. In today's fast-paced, often superficial society, we are all challenged to choose between convenience and integrity, between silence and accountability. Charles chose integrity, and it changed everything. Let this story be a reminder: no matter your position, you have the power to demand better, to lead by example, and to restore humanity where it's been lost. If you found value in this message, please like, subscribe, and share this video. You never know who might need this reminder today.